they're planning to spend how many billions on this Golden Dome protection for the United States. Again, a fantasy project, and it's almost like, bread and circuses at the decline of the Roman Empire, the last days when these follies seize the empire in the magnificent sense, they go down in a swirl of turpitude and incompetence.
Or if I may put it in a slightly different way, you can't expect deindustrialized, financialized countries to be able to fight wars. I mean, what are they going to fight with? Easy money creation, bonds, whatever, asset market inflation. All they've got is bubbles. They've got no capacity to make anything. Hello and welcome to the 48th Geopolitical Economy Hour, the show that explores the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of our time. I'm Radhika Desai, and today I'm joined by Professor Richard Sakwa. Welcome back, Richard.
It's great to be back with you.
Great. So, Richard, today I feel I want to bring together two things. The first is the book you are just completing. You're completing a new book on Ukraine, which is the latest in a long line of books that you have been writing. Of course, you are a scholar of not only Russia today, but of the Soviet Union in the past. And you've been writing about the Ukraine situation at least since 2015. And so since then, I know I can tell our listeners that you have written at least 4 very important books. There was the most recent one is, of course, The Culture of the Second Cold War. Before that, you wrote The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. You also wrote the mighty interesting book Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War. And of course, in 2015, very early in the genesis of the current conflict, you wrote Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, which, of course, I've seen being commented on and being referred to very widely. And your newest book is entitled The Russo-Ukrainian War, and its subtitle is Follies of Empire. Now, I think that, talking to you today, as you are in the throes of, finishing the book, you have to finish it in the next couple of months. And I thought, what could be more relevant, than to have somebody like you to comment on what's really going on? Because if the headlines are anything to go by, Trump's breezy optimism that he was somehow going to solve the Ukraine conflict, famously in his first day in office, is falling with a big thud on hard realities. So most recently, Trump has said that the Russian president is playing with fire. As you can see from this tweet, he says, what Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of bad things would have already happened in Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire. And before that, as many people will know, he said that Trump had gone absolutely crazy. He says, I've always had a good relationship with him, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy. He's needlessly killing people. And I'm not just talking about soldiers and blah, blah, and so on. So essentially, he's clearly not very happy with President Putin. And this, of course, came after Russia had hit Kiev with what was billed as the largest drone and missile attack of the war so far. And that came on the heels of what at least we hear. This is not widely reported in the press, but we see at least that the Kiev Independent has reported it, if in a slightly tendentious way, says that a Russian commander claims that Putin's helicopter was at the epicenter of a Ukrainian drone attack, which was, of course, occurred before the most recent and very massive Russian attack. So this is what's going on. And so what we've seen over the last, since Trump has taken office, he has gone from talking with Putin and leaving the Europeans and Ukrainians out. He's tried to do economic deals, and also, of course, that has included both Putin and Zelensky in turn. He has given Zelensky the infamous dressing down in the Oval Office back in February. Then he had shown irritation with President Putin when in the talks and negotiations that were attempted, Putin simply restated his military goals, his military aims in Ukraine, which it seems have remained unchanged at least since last summer, if not on the whole before that. So this situation has Trump threatening to take a pass and abandoning the attempt to promote peace, and even claiming now that he's going to leave it to the Pope, etc. But at the same time, and here's, this is part of this kind of, very changeable weather that we are getting used to with Trump. His administration is engaged very heavily, militarily engaged very heavily in Scandinavia, and they are militarizing that region and the Baltics more generally. So my question to you, Richard, is how do you assess what's going on right now? I mean, do you think, would you agree, as I'm sort of seeming to surmise, but you're the expert here, that if we read between the lines of the varying stories that Trump likes to tell himself and the rest of us, that we can discern that Trump has run out of road in Ukraine, that essentially the realities on the ground are forcing him out. They are exposing the breezy optimism of the idea that he could easily solve the Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there. So that finally, Trump is hitting the hard rock of reality of what's going on. And in posing as the mediator, he was negating or rejecting or suppressing his earlier part, because I remember in this first administration, he was the one who started providing the Stinger and other missiles from 2017 onwards, something which even Obama refused to do. But at the same time, even as he was doing that, Trump was always putting himself forward as a friend of Russia attempting to achieve rapprochement. He couldn't do it the first time. Trump won because of Russiagate, because of the book, which I explored in the Deception book, the way that Russiagate was a way precisely designed to hobble his ability to modify the US traditional foreign policy stance. So the big picture, and there's so many other bits to it, but just the big picture at the moment, as far as I can see it, is that what Trump is doing now, and his colleagues, is to try to wrench US foreign policy with huge pain away from traditional neoconservative positions. I mean, a long time ago, he abandoned the liberal interventionism and, spreading democracy and so on. He did that in the first term quite explicitly. But the neocon idea that you have to beat up on Iran, you have to beat up on the Houthis, Ansarallah in Yemen and others, which is that he just can't, he's moving away. It's the end of that. Well, I mean, we're at the beginning of the end of the neoconservative dominance in US foreign policy. And Trump is shifting it to a more traditional great power politics. Now, that's the epochal shift which he's trying to achieve at this time. Clearly, he has huge difficulty. He had it in his first administration. How on earth he hoped to try to achieve something along those lines while appointing the John Boltons and the others of this world? Classic, John Bolton has never seen a war that he didn't like. And the neocons dominated. This time, he's been slightly more selective, not entirely, of course. Tulsi Gabbard, obviously the outstanding figure, who repudiates that tradition. And so Trump is trying to do, in his classically, typically rebarbative, narcissistic, incoherent manner. But the deep insight which he has is the one that which should have happened. Well, many would argue it should have happened at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. If you remember Jean Kirkpatrick, who was Reagan's representative to the United Nations, at that point she said, why does the United States should become a normal great power? In other words, to give up its messianic ambitions, its emphasis on its how exceptional it was, and just to say, no, we're just another great power, we're another trading power, and if you try to take advantage of us, we're going to slap you with tariffs and do that. That was already a Trump theme back in the 1980s. So Jeane Kirkpatrick's idea, and there's a whole literature on this, to normalize US foreign policy. Now, we have an individual who is the most abnormal individual at the helm of the United States for many a decade, trying to achieve the paradoxical outcome, which is a normalization of US foreign policy. But that's what's going on. So a shift from an ideological foreign policy to a great power, transactional, mercantilist, and so on, however inept, incoherent, inconsistent, all that is.
But do you really believe that Trump is really trying to essentially accept the normalization of what you're calling normalization? I remember a book that was written back in the 1970s by Richard Rosekrantz, America as an Ordinary Country.
Yep.
That sort of, and this was written in the 70s, at a time when the United States was having another encounter with realities, shall we say, with the defeat in the Vietnam War, stagflation, et cetera, the loss of, the dollars linked to gold having to be broken, Europeans becoming more and more, shall we say, stroppy, and so on. But so this was in a different context. But you're saying that people like Jeane Kirkpatrick were trying to say we should become a normal power, etc. But of course that, but it doesn't seem to me to be quite so. Although I could be wrong. But here's the thing: Trump still wants to make America great again. Trump still wants to dominate the world. Trump still wants the dollar to be the world's currency, no matter how much he also wants it, to somehow serve his fantastical notions about reindustrializing America and so on. So in all of these ways, you might say that I'm not so sure that Trump wants to return the US or to, some kind of ordinary normalization. Or do you think, it seems to me that it may very well be that he had this, like I said earlier, kind of breezy notion that he was going to solve the problems. Because remember, he's out to distinguish himself from the liberal establishment of the United States. So he's always said, you guys are, you guys create the war. I'm going to create the peace. I'm the deal maker. I'm, going to show you how to really do peace, etc. But he's now realizing that he cannot do that. So in a certain sense, it's not that he's succeeding in what he set out to do in the first place, as you say, quite incoherently as he will. That is his wont. But nevertheless, do you think he even clearly wants the normalization of US foreign policy?
Yes, you're absolutely right. But what we are witnessing is a de-ideologization. He still wants the United States to be the top dog as a great power, but not as a messianic power of the neocon or the liberal vision, which came together, unfortunately, over the last 20 years. So he does want to do that. And one of those elements is a rapprochement with Russia. And in part, that is part of the calculus, is that you do that rapprochement with Moscow, and then you could focus the fire. And it doesn't necessarily mean war with China. So that's because obviously all strategic thinkers in Washington consider China as the major peer competitor, if not the enemy, but certainly the major threat. Just as Japan was considered in the 1980s, so China today. So in a sense, this isn't an ideological stance. It's a mercantile stance. But he understands, perhaps, amid all of the flim and all of the endless flam, that ultimately, it doesn't make sense for the United States to alienate the two great other powers in the world today. So you try to peel Russia away from China, which is, of course, a losing proposition, but nevertheless, to rapprochement, and on that basis, then perhaps to put an end to a Ukraine war, which, as far as Trump is concerned, is a total distraction from all the far more important things, which, as you say, is to reassert United States economic dominance in the way you've outlined, and of course its military and strategic dominance globally. But as just a top dog amongst a lot of dogs baying in the pack of the great power pack.
So how would you distinguish between Trump's foreign, the kind of approach Trump is taking and the kind of approach Biden and Obama before him took? And how do you distinguish his approach from the approach that currently the Europeans are taking?
It's fascinating that you mention Obama, because what Trump is doing, as I've suggested with Jean Kirkpatrick and so many more, is something which has been the undertow of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and that is that this Atlantic alliance system, the political West, has outlived its usefulness. And Obama already was, as the first US president who wasn't fully European in his outlook, and obviously, just of his personal background. So he wasn't so vested, let me put it this way, in the Atlantic alliance system. And obviously he was the pivot to Asia under his watch. So there has been an undertow, so Trump is taking it to its logical conclusion. You mentioned Biden, but absolutely, Biden was a classic dyed-in-the-wool, as I mentioned before, 50 years at the head or involved deeply in US foreign policy, but almost on every single major foreign policy decision made the wrong one. And of course, once he came in 2021, he empowered precisely this, this revanchist idea vis-a-vis Russia, the whole recommitment to an Atlantic alliance system, which had really basically achieved its sell-by date 30 or 40 years ago. So Biden really quite a catastrophic leadership, and I think he'll go down in history as probably one of the worst US presidents ever. But that takes us to the European Union and the European powers. It's absolutely fascinating, well, in a most frightening way, to watch this evolution. First, European Union, in my representation in the old days, was set up as a peace project, obviously much exaggerated, but nevertheless, it was basically an idea to transcend the logic of war on European continent. But today, of course, it's become the opposite. It has become from a welfare project to a warfare project, and we can see all of that. And indeed, it wants to continue the war in Ukraine to the final and conclusive defeat of Russia. How it could even think of doing this against a nuclear power, I simply cannot understand, because you can't win ultimately against a nuclear power. You have to negotiate, you have to accept certain conditions, which in this case would be a neutral, non-aligned, non-NATO Ukraine. And that would, in a sense, defuse it. Why the European Union simply is, in other words, the European Union today is more papist than the Pope. And I don't mean that literally, of course, but of course more Americanized than America itself. So if Trump is de-Americanizing in a way that we can talk about in a minute, but the United States, Europe considers itself now the repository, first of all, of the set of values, that is, the liberal internationalism and neocon vision, which is now leaving the United States but found a very solid home in Europe. And second, it believes that in some peculiar way, it can win this war, which is a sign that it has lost strategic reality. And in other words, that it has become an ideological project in the worst sense of the term. And by that, I mean reification of certain set of principles which are no longer, vividly reflecting the actual life in reality. In other words, they're taking a set of principles to the point of madness. I mean, any observer would say, how are you planning to, without the United States, to supply arms? You've got almost nothing left. You can't even supply 1 million 155 millimeter shells. Endless talk now, 4 years, and you still haven't got to it, etc., etc. But above all, there's visceral, violent Russophobia. And of course, that is a legacy of the East European states, Poland and the Baltic republics above all, joined by Romania again today, because of the way that they were incorporated into European Union, in which Europeanism itself became an ideology rather than a reality, which was designed to achieve, public goods of peace, reconciliation, transcending the logic of conflict. And in short, the EU is today perpetuating precisely Cold War, taken to the next level up, which we didn't even have in the first Cold War, vis-a-vis Russia. For example, we're in the middle of peace negotiations. Russia says it's going to prepare a memorandum as outlined in that telephone call with Trump about its positions for peace, and Ukraine is, after endless protestations, doing the same. And they're talking about the next month or so, they will have a document, and on that basis, continuing the negotiations which began in Istanbul. That's normal. That's called diplomacy. And the European Union seems to totally lack that. So what are they doing? Even while this is going on. So Trump's process is working. I mean, how it'll end, who knows? But it is actually taking place. And instead of which, they're now adopting the 17th package of sanctions. And indeed, sticking sticks in the spokes of the wheel to sabotage the peace process. The demand for a 30-day ceasefire without conditions is basically using the ceasefire as an instrument of war. Again, who are these people? Well, we know who they are. Kaja Kallas, Ursula von der Leyen, Kublius, and Radek Sikorski from Poland, and all these others, and Friedrich Merz now in Germany, who is a viscerally Russophobe, whose whole career is based on denying the vision of Ostpolitik, the old vision way back from the late 1960s. Of transcendence of the logic of conflict, and more than that, a sort of vision of rapprochement between Germany and Russia, the Soviet Union earlier.
I mean, you had just added a very interesting point, because I've been, all of us actually have been trying to puzzle out the rationale behind Europe's manifestly suicidal policies in Ukraine. I mean, the European Union is rather than trying to make good relations with Russia so that it can benefit from cheap Russian energy and so on, which Merkel tried to do for a while. They are essentially trying to make an enemy of Russia. This is suicidal economically. It is also suicidal from a security point of view, because the one way you do not make yourself secure is by making an enemy of your most powerful neighbor, which is exactly what they're doing. But, but I also wonder, so the element you've added is that you've pointed out that I agree with you, that, the very terms in which the Eastern European countries were incorporated into the EU and into NATO has essentially meant that, especially now that so many of the Western European countries are themselves in political crisis and so on, they are becoming the Eastern European tail that's wagging the European dog. And so on. So I think there's much to be said for that. And I think it may also be that you could make the argument that people like Merz, in some limited sense at least, represent some kind of a rationale, because, of course, Germany is up to its neck in Eastern Europe. I mean, you go to Eastern Europe and you see everywhere a German economic presence. And so they want to keep the Eastern Europeans on side. And the easiest way to do it is to essentially tell them, the same old story. Oh, you were oppressed by the Russians and now we have liberated you, and we are never going to let you go back to that, and so on. So you've added that element, and that element also should be contrasted, just as earlier you contrasted Biden and Trump and so on. The current European leadership should be contrasted with Merkel, who did, it seemed, try to make a serious effort to make a go of it. And remember, even at the beginning of the special military operation, it was Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron who were going back and forth between, Europe and Russia, trying to see if they could make peace. But in the end, of course, it was the Americans, Biden and the Biden administration, Boris Johnson, and of course, I'm sure with a hefty dose of Eastern European influence, was sabotage this agreement that might have stopped the war in its early months. So that element is very good. But I also, having said that, I also want to share something else with you, because it seems to me that there was a very interesting story in the Financial Times, which I'm about to share. And what I want to get out of this is that do you think it's possible? Let me rephrase that. Do you think it's possible that the Europeans are biding their time? They think that Trump will not run again, or he will lose the next election. And then you will have a more normal, what they would consider a more normal leadership in the United States, and then everything will be fine and they can go back to square one. And all they have to do is to hold on until then. And so this is the story that came out in the Financial Times just a couple of days ago on the 25th of May. And it's a very big, long story, and it's entitled Expect No Miracle, which is essentially a quotation from Valery Zaluzhny, which I'll come to in a minute. And then it says, Ukraine braces for Russia's summer offensive. And what it contains, apart from the usual Russophobia and so on, are three things that I wanted to mention. The first is that they clearly recognize that the Ukrainian army is exhausted, that this exhaustion and frustration is spreading through the ranks, that morale is fraying, and then that they are even recognizing that essentially there is the problem is flawed planning at the top levels of the Ukrainian military leadership that is sending men in harm's way. And then this man is being quoted, Alexander Shirshin, he was being quoted as saying, in recent months, it has started to feel like we are being erased, like our lives are being treated as disposable. The problems are systemic, not personal, he added, urging a sober reassessment of operational capacity and a strategy that matches battlefield reality. For the FT, which is as Russophobic as you get, to even admit that there are problems on the Ukrainian side is a very interesting thing. Second point is that they are having difficulties recruiting. So even though, they've tried to recruit, they can't really match the Russian figures. And they even say, repeat a story which so far I've only heard sort of in the non-mainstream media, that recruitment officers are nabbing unregistered men off the street and stuffing them into vans, etc. And finally, this is the quotation from Zaluzhny. He's saying he warned a London audience on Thursday not to expect some kind of miracle that will bring peace to Ukraine. So basically, it's like we are digging in for the long haul. So sorry to go on for a bit, but you see what I'm asking, and please comment on that.
Yeah, I've got three comments. Thank you for that. The first one is going back to our European leaders. You're absolutely right that Macron and Scholz just before the war, early 2022, and right at the beginning, made a very deep personal commitment to try to negotiate. And I applaud them for that. I don't usually applaud them, but I do. Obviously, anybody who's going to talk and try to achieve peace and diplomacy gets my vote. But what it showed, though, is that their efforts had absolutely no traction. And first of all, they offered Putin nothing. They ignored the two treaties which he put forwards in December, a new security treaty which picked up where Medvedev had started in 2008, 2009. And, even going back to Gorbachev's ideas, right at the beginning. So, but they didn't engage. So they talked, but it just showed the powerlessness of what I nowadays call the legacy powers in Europe. They're legacy powers. They know, just like the legacy media, it's lost its mojo, to use modern language. And these guys, Macron, Scholz, they were just treading water because ultimately decisions were taken in Washington. And the decision had been taken by, it wasn't even Biden, of course. It wasn't even Blinken. We know who it was, Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan, when the history books are written, and which I'm starting to do now, is that he is ultimately the eminence grise behind this war. He's a virulent Russophobe. He was the one who started Russiagate, of course, which stopped it. So in other words, when he really is like the Zbigniew Brzezinski of our days, really tough. So that's the first point. It just shows, in other words, how marginal Europe is or European leaders are to the fate of their own continent. And that, for me, has been a disaster. And I've been warning about this for 20 years. I mean, one doesn't have to, call oneself a Gaullist or whatever, or even a Gorbachevian, but simply to say that this vision, or Mitterrand even, his Confederation of Europe idea, the idea of European continent taking responsibility for its own fate, its destiny, and on a pan-continental scale, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, is the most urgent and most important feature, I think, of certainly our politics today. I mean, our European, our regional politics. And how we can get there, I've absolutely no idea, but at least to have a sense of it. As for the European leaders today biding their time, I agree completely. They think that, that Trump can't, well, he technically cannot stand again in 2028. And so therefore they consider this a storm which will pass and business as usual will emerge. And of course, they're living in the land of illusion, because we certainly don't know what will happen in 2028, but Trump this time is actually nurturing possible successes. And obviously, in choosing J.D. Vance, it's quite clearly a possibility. Who knows? Because we can't tell the future. So, in other words, the fever that they hope will break is actually a fever which has seized them, and they are the symptom of the fever itself. They're part of the illness. So it won't end, because what we're seeing is a decay of, which you've alluded to, the decay of internal coherence and the attachment to their own normative principles. And we've seen it so outrageously in the Romanian election, the cancellation of the November verdict, Caroline Georgescu. And then, of course, the falsehoods which have continued and which are in the British mass media every day, when at the time of the election, that Russia interfered in that election, when we know, and everyone knows, that it was those TikTok tweets and so on were put there by the National Liberal Party. In other words, another oppositionist, but, working in a centre. It's a common fact. And yet the fact that the British media, I don't know about the US media, just simply ignores that, a well-known fact. And that is just ultimately shows the bankruptcy of these people. And the final thing, to go on to the military situation in Ukraine today, again, that's ultimately, we have always believed, and we all believe ultimately that, that these issues cannot be resolved on the battlefield, and it has to be diplomacy. But maybe this war shows us that we're mistaken, that ultimately the battlefield outcome will be decisive and it will ultimately settle things. And what would it settle? It will discredit NATO, of course, for good. It will discredit these European leaders who've been vested in a war effort well past the time at which a realistic prospect of achieving those goals, which are returning the 1991 borders, Ukraine and NATO, and so on and so forth, simply are not realistic. Moscow said years and years ago they weren't going to accept it. They launched a dreadful war. We all agree this is wars are absolutely awful. But, to make the point, they said we're not bluffing, and, they weren't bluffing. The idea to think that European leaders think they can still achieve those goals, and well, obviously Zelensky has to. His hard line is ultra nationalists, which the Maidan Revolution, inspired by husbanded, organized by Biden and Nuland and others. They've empowered forces in Ukraine, which is now, again, to use your analogy, the West has become, that Ukrainian tail is wagging the European and Atlantic dog. So, they've now caught themselves up into all sorts of contradictions, which is one perhaps reason for the violence of the language, understanding that their own futility and their own intellectual and political bankruptcy. So they're doing it. And so, yes, somewhat offensive, as you've been looking at the media here, they're saying Russian forces are moving so slowly and so on. Well, we will say, obviously, drone warfare has changing the nature of warfare. We've seen this attack, as you say, this weekend's attacks. It's been mutual. Russia did have a big attack on Kiev and other cities, but equally, Ukraine launched several hundred drones towards Moscow, and some of them launched perhaps by Ukrainian operatives within Russia. So
Within Russia.
so in other words, drone warfare, and very soon we'll be talking about artificially intelligence targeting of these drones, with much further distance, much more powerful and much more intelligent. So the nature of warfare is going to change. And ultimately, why should this war ultimately stay there? What's to stop these drones one day going to Poland and going further west? If they can go 2,000 kilometers, who knows? We really have to wrap this up. And this is what Trump, again, such a flawed vessel, but he makes more sense on certain issues than probably anybody else. Just shows how awful our times are.
I mean, and I want to ask a big question about Russia and a smaller question about Ukraine. But before I do that, two quick points. So, number one, again, coming to this flawed vessel thing and Trump. I mean, I really still don't know. He's been saying these, Putin is crazy, etc. And I'm not at all sure in which direction he will turn, because I remember even after the dressing down that he gave and J.D. Vance gave to Zelensky in the White House, when everybody thought this was finished, the United States was no longer going to support Ukraine, etc. But since then, there has been a lot of wavering, and what's more, I think that if Trump is now acting so, saying such negative things about Russia, that it's not clear to me that he will try to make peace. And if he doesn't try to make peace, then will he just, nonchalantly, without caring about it, continue the war? Because at the end of the day, it does make lots of money for his cronies in the military-industrial complex and what have you, even though people may die, etc. But the more important point is that the Europeans. I have another little graph which I can quickly share. The Europeans have been apparently stepping up. So you can see here a graph going back to the first quarter of 2022, and the contribution of the United States in the dark blue and Europe in the light blue. And you see here that in the last quarter of 2024, of course, Biden knew he was leaving office, so he was supplying Ukraine with everything that he could throw in their direction. But since then the American contribution, at least according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, has dwindled to next to nothing. Meanwhile, the Europeans are sort of holding the fort. But as you say, you rightly point out that the Europeans' ability to supply Ukraine is not so great. Having said that, two other things are going on. They are that of course, Merz has essentially proclaimed a new industrial policy, which is going to focus on the military-industrial complex, on expansion of the military industries. And, what do you make of that? That will certainly increase their capacity to produce arms. But more importantly, I've always thought that if the Europeans were going to spend a lot more money on their military, then I think that the whole equation within NATO will change. Why should they take orders from Washington? If they are spending the money, who pays the piper calls the tune. If the Europeans are paying the piper to a much greater extent, then they will definitely demand their share of, say, in how NATO is run and what priorities it has and so on. So where do you see these things going?
No, the shift in Europe towards what people are now calling military Keynesianism, obviously Russia's been doing that for a few years. So they say, well, actually, that seems to be not such a bad idea. Of course, in Russia's in the thick of a war, for the Europeans to do it, it's a sign precisely of their own intellectual and political exhaustion. If this is the best that they can do, then it's like. But the consequences are potentially huge, because Europe, Western Europe, has been seized by a war fever. And as you know, all these German and other generals, the Danish one as well, and the Dutch saying, well, we should prepare for war with Russia within 5 years. It's almost unthinkable with a nuclear power. Again, one is constantly thinking, have these people taken leave of their senses? Whereas But as you say, it's useful for them because it gets them out of an economic black dark hole. And of course, it pleases the United States to be spending now up to 5%. So it's another way of trying to placate the angry god over the water. But at the same time, it is, this endless talk of European strategic autonomy, which has been, in the background for many, many years. But we are witnessing a historic decoupling of the two wings of the Atlantic Alliance system. It has been a shibboleth, an article of faith for 80 years, obviously in wartime, but since then reforged after 47, the Cold War, then 49, the Washington Treaty. So, but we're witnessing the end of the political West. It's now decoupling. And it's moving on, and the dynamics of it. You've suggested a couple of elements to it, which is that if Europe rearms, then it is no longer strategically dependent militarily for security from Washington. Of course, then that raises the ugly head of the nuclear issue. Already Macron, in his typical almost Johnsonian, bombastic and blustery manner, said that the discussion can take place about Europeanizing the French nuclear deterrent,
Yes.
which is really frightening. And some talk in Germany about nuclearizing as well. So that comes back. And of course, Biden has his dreadful legacy, the Trump proofing of the war, and indeed to capture and to entail Europe in that war for years, the placing of nuclear or tactical weapons, intermediate nuclear weapons in Germany from 2026 onwards. One of the major historical events of our time. If you remember the Euro missile crisis of the 1980s, but this time almost without a peep. And that is another sign of the way that politics has now been, genuine contestatory politics has declined in the European context. There's far more debate and activism and far more lively public sphere in the United States than this almost moribund life which we have, political life which we have. There are sometimes Stop the War coalitions very active. CND is still working, and many, many organisations. The International Manifesto Group, to mention one, but and others, of course. So it's not completely dead. But where are those great leaders? Where that huge European nuclear disarmament of the early 1980s? Almost nothing now. The peace movements, yes, they're there, but much weaker. The churches themselves, do they dare to speak anymore? No, they've been intimidated and concerned with identity politics and so much else. Yeah, so it's a really tough thing. As for Trump walking away from it, from the element, he may try, but ultimately the United States, he may personally be less involved. But on the other hand, he's still aiming for the accolade as the Nobel Peace Prize. It seems rather bizarre, but there you go. But even now, even as we're talking, there are those talks with Iran going on at this very time. And, I must say again, this is better than anything we've seen for 40 years. Unfortunately, he's piling on yet more sanctions against Cuba, against Venezuela, and so on. But, just one other point in all of this is that there's a very good article I saw the other day in Unheard, the online journal Unheard, about just how weak US military power is. Ostensibly, they've got 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, but at most, according to this piece, only 4 in a working condition. And, also they point out, which didn't really need to be pointed out, that United Kingdom has got 2, but effectively naught, because they don't have the planes, they don't have the personnel, then half the time they're not even working, and so on. So, and of course, the supplies of these missiles and the supplies of Patriot air defense, they're planning to spend how many billions on this Golden Dome protection for the United States. Again, a fantasy project, and it's almost like bread and circuses at the decline of the Roman Empire, the last days when these follies seize the empire in a magnificent sense. They go down in a swirl of turpitude and incompetence.
Or if I may put it in a slightly different way, you can't expect deindustrialized, financialized countries to be able to fight wars. I mean, what are they going to fight with, easy money creation, bonds, whatever, asset market inflation. All they've got is bubbles. They've got no capacity to make anything. But, while you were talking as well, I had this vivid image in my mind of Kaya Kallas sitting with her finger on the nuclear button. And I thought, oh dear, it sent a shudder down my spine. Can you imagine this warmongering person who has absolutely no idea of the consequences of what she's saying? Someone like her actually having, their finger on the nuclear button. I mean, it is really, really frightening, but that's where we're at.
Well,
okay.
Just to say that Liz Truss, remember, she said,
Yes.
when asked, the normal answer, asked her, would you be willing to use it, is obviously you fudge the issue. But she said, yeah, sure, I'm happy to do it. I mean, at that point, you realize the decline of the Western elites and leadership.
The quality of Western political leadership absolutely was scraping the bottom of the barrel. So, brief question about Ukraine, and then big question about Russia, and then we should wind down because we are coming close to we'll be coming close to an hour. But short question about Ukraine is really, there are so many issues. We just looked at the whole issue of the Ukraine's ability to fight. There are longer term issues of the fact that Zelensky's leadership is being questioned. Zelensky is remaining leader only after imposing a fairly draconian type of, banning of opposition parties and so on. So, really, where do you think Ukraine is going? Where does it stand now, and what are its prospects? And then I'll ask you, the bigger questions that really involve Russia itself. Yeah.
If that's the little question, I'm frightened about the big one. Yeah. So, yeah. It's where's it going? All predictions are falsified. Sure, the morale, as you mentioned earlier, is fraying, and just simply the resources in personnel and material and some for them to continue the war. Yet they're holding the line. That, according to some estimates, the Ukraine has now still some 800,000 men on the front line. Obviously, some of them have been there for, well, I was going to say years almost now, which is extraordinary, whereas Russia has rotation. Russia's got about 650,000, and yet, as you say, they've got major forces in reserve, and they're pushing forwards all along the front. They're pushing forwards in Sumy, they're pushing forwards elsewhere, but at the moment, the tactics, because of drones, the advantage lies with the defender. And obviously, also, the Ukrainian...
I'm just sharing this map, which you are welcome to refer to, which was published in the FT. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, that is useful. So as you can see, all along, there's little pushes forward. The red shows where they're moving ahead. And also trying to push away from Kursk and Belgorod oblasts in the north. So... So where's it going? It depends on this summer offensive, the military campaign. Already, the sense is I think that reading some of these expert analyses, they're talking about a major offensive this summer, a weakening of Ukrainian positions. People are not really anticipating. Some people were talking earlier of this, whatever called the German advance in March 1918. They went forwards, and of course, by the summer they were exhausted, and they collapsed by the autumn. So a German-type collapse after 4 years of war, and we're now in fourth year of war, is not excluded. but I'm not sure how likely it is, because you have this hardcore Ukrainian nationalists who, are doing everything you mentioned earlier, the bussification of people being dragged off the street, press ganged into the front line. But this is a war of attrition, and Russia ultimately has more resources to win such a war. And at the moment, the territory isn't the key issue. It's to weaken the Ukrainian forces. So some sort of collapse by the end of the year is not excluded. So that's the possibility.
That's
which means, of course, that peace will then be some sort of deal at the end of the year or first quarter 2026.
With a newly constituted leadership, because it seems to me that at least one of the biggest obstacles to a peace deal at the moment is that actually the Ukrainians don't have a credible government with which Russia can conclude a viable deal, a deal that will be kept, an agreement that will be kept. So that's really fascinating. So
can I just interrupt you there, just to say that also applies, of course, to Zelensky's allies, the Western European ones. So the only one, again paradoxically, who could guarantee a peace is Donald Trump. But of course, he is not, he's got a term limit. So if Russia, who is the guarantor? And so therefore, then that's why we have to have external forces. China, Brazil, South Africa, other respected global leaders would have to ultimately make it stick. With Trump, the United States is essential, because that would give it legitimacy and that would give it force for the Ukrainians themselves. So
that is so fascinating. I mean, because the Europeans have done everything possible to discredit themselves as a viable interlocutor for Russia. So absolutely. So now let's come to Russia. So basically, it seems to me that, of course, 17th package of sanctions is not going to hurt Russia one bit. Russia has become pretty sanction-proof. Russia has its alliance with China is going great guns. The Putin's legitimacy at home is at a great is very great, unlike Zelensky's, or for that matter even Trump's, or that of any other Western leader that I can think of. But at the same time, so what are Russia's aims? What are the prospects of them achieving it? And before you do that, I just thought I would share a couple of points with you, because it seems as though, although Putin is not saying any of these things, it seems as though elements in the Russian administration, with or without his agreement, are saying two things that I find extremely fascinating. So former President Medvedev has published this map in which basically he shows that, all the four Western provinces plus Crimea will remain will become part of Russia, more or less. And then the rest of Ukraine, everything except the blue bit that you see at the extreme western end, will become a buffer zone, whatever that means. But I think that this kind of super maximalist a claim is being made or proposition is being made so that everything that Putin does afterwards sounds very reasonable. And then there was really something quite interesting, which is that an advisor to the president called Anton Kobyakov has put about that the Soviet Union was dissolved illegally. And he makes, by the way, an argument that is not entirely beyond the realms of credibility, because he basically says that the only entity that could have dissolved the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, would have been the body that created it. And since the Soviet Union was dissolved by a meeting of the presidents of Russia, Belarusia, and Ukraine, that this did not really work. So anyway, this is being put about, which of course will, if and when this is not being reported widely in the West, but if and when it is reported widely in the West, of course, the Western press will have a field day saying, "We told you, Putin was trying to recreate the Soviet Union, etc. So, given all this background, I mean, what do you expect? What do you think President Putin is doing now, and what do you expect? What is he trying to achieve, and what are the prospects of success for him?
If I can pick up on that final point, or penultimate point, I think it's absolutely fascinating, this debate which has suddenly emerged about the legitimacy and legality of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I could just add one more item which they're discussing in that context, and that is to say that Ukraine's declaration of independence was also illegal. They declared independence, if I'm not mistaken, on the 26th of August 1991, after the failed putsch in Moscow. But according to the Soviet law at the time, it had to be accompanied by a referendum, and there wasn't one. There was the retrospective one in December, the 1st of December, but that is something else afterwards. So anyway, let the lawyers battle that one out. But it's interesting that the debate is taking place. But again, to say that you're absolutely right that whether Russia is, sanctions are damaging, and of course there's a lot of bravado and chutzpah in Moscow to say, bring it on, and the last thing we want is to see these sanctions end. Of course it's damaging. I mean, for example, the absence of direct flights and so much more, and the technological transfer issues and financial impediments and so on. But your key point is correct, of course. The Russian economy last year grew by 4.2% odd, the year before 3.7%. This year it's going to be much lower, deliberately so. So because the economy was overheating, and so they're trying to calm it down. So yes, the budget deficit was going to be 0.5% because the fall of average oil prices down. They're now budgeting at $65 a barrel rather than the 65 they were thinking earlier, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's going to be tough. So there's going to be a budget deficit of 1.7%, which is peanuts compared to the US and the UK. And they've got resources. So I don't think we're looking at an economic collapse. Political stability is there. Putin is still enjoying stratospheric popularity, and it's difficult in wartime to gauge all of this in a relatively authoritarian system. But nevertheless, I think everybody who's there knows that it's still up in the 70s. Top 70%, which is amazing. So we're not expecting a regime collapse within Russia today. And there's they keep, as you know, those who talk about decolonizing Russia, saying that we have to the ethnic republics and so on. I think there's stability. The alignment with China is holding firm. And obviously, Beijing's calculation is that if Russia falls, then the next, and it's explicit in Washington, so we should obviously buttress Russia as much as possible, because they'll come after us next, which again is a folly of the US empire strategy at this moment. They make it explicit. We have to wrap up the Russian business so we can start on China. Well, they're not stupid in Beijing, so of course, and perhaps they're providing more surreptitious support, dual-use technology, and so on than we know. So you're absolutely right in all of that. And some of them in Russia are making these super maximalist demands of everything else, and there's quite an interesting debate. And indeed, the feeling amongst these people is that the Ukrainian state has lost its right to exist. Now, that is a super maximalist state, and I certainly not a view that I endorse. That ultimately, at the end of it, and this for me is very important, at the end of it, I would like to see a viable Ukrainian state in which the other Ukraine, and it is to that other Ukraine that this book we talked about at the beginning, is dedicated. And what is this other Ukraine? It's those I talked about in the Frontline Ukraine book a good few years back, 2015, which these are the pluralistic, multi-confessional, multi-tolerant, open-minded, multilingual Ukraine, the best of Ukraine. And this is the other Ukraine which spoke in the May 2014 elections when they elected Poroshenko Pyotr as the peace candidate, and even louder in April 2019 when 73% voted for Zelensky as the peace candidate. Both times they were betrayed, but that constituency, the other Ukrainian, not this virulently pro-Western, not this ultra-nationalistic, not this intolerant, this neoliberal, neocon Ukraine. And this other Ukraine is what we want to see. And we want to see that in living in harmony with Russia and, of course, working with harmony with everyone else, of course. And that is what we can do. That's where this maximalists, I think, are mistaken. And, of course, part of this whole exercise was to try to get a different leadership in Ukraine. But this has to come from within Ukraine itself. And to stop this pernicious Western pulling of Ukraine to the West, which, of course, empowers the maximalist within Ukraine itself.
And not just to the West, but to the extreme right. So, I mean,
yeah, indeed.
So
spatially and politically, yes.
Exactly, yes.
The maximalist. Yeah.
And so for Putin, I mean, do you think that he expects that there will be a peace deal anytime soon? Do you think that, obviously, without any trustworthy parties to come to an agreement with, I guess his only option is to try to create realities on the ground?
Yes, at the moment, indeed. So we said there's no military solution. Well, perhaps, ultimately there is no military solution, but the military solutions have to be then wrapped in the envelope of diplomacy. And
or let's put it another way, that of course in the end there must be diplomacy, but until there can be diplomacy, Putin will try to achieve, try to create the realities on the ground which any diplomacy must take care of.
And that's exactly what the European powers are trying to do, of course, in piling in the weapons to Ukraine to enhance their negotiating position when it comes to it. So
that is also so interesting. They are not giving weapons so Ukraine may win. They are giving weapons so that they have a finger in the pie when there will be an agreement. That is so true, Richard. Thank you so much. Look, I mean, this has been fantastic, and as our conversation already reveals, this is not ending anytime soon. We will be back again talking about this, in the months to come. But thank you for an absolutely fascinating discussion, Richard. It's been richer than I thought it would be for whatever. I mean, I guess that's why you're the historian. You know all the deep facts, and you can relate what's going on right now to all that happened years ago, and sometimes even decades ago and centuries ago. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a great discussion. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.